Welcome to the Microgreens Mastery Podcast. I'm your host, Jonah Krochmalnik. Together, we'll explore the art of turning tiny seeds into a thriving microgreens empire, sharing insights, coveted secrets, and strategic wisdom from building one of Canada's largest microgreens farms. Stay tuned for thought-provoking conversations with leading figures in the world of microgreens. Welcome to the podcast, everyone. On today's episode, we have Jacob from Goldfarm Canada in Guelph, Ontario, back on the podcast. This episode is focusing on strategic decision-making for your business, including options on how to expand your business, the pros and cons of taking on a distributor, the benefits of working with a business coach for Jacob, and so much more. This episode is full of really great microgreens business strategy, so let's get right into it. Hey, Jacob, welcome back to the podcast. It's great to have you back after, I think you were one of the first guests we had on the podcast. We also recorded a tour of your farm on YouTube, which is really great for anyone who wants to check that out. But I'd love to hear, kind of where you guys are at now and just see how things are going on the farm.
For sure. Thanks for having me back, Jonah. It's always a pleasure to get into this stuff with you. Yeah, I mean, things are going really well on the farm. We're sitting at 30% year over year growth, which I'm pretty happy with. Q1 in this neck of the woods in Southern Ontario to still be at this kind of pace is excellent because, as a lot of people might know, this is the slow time for restaurants. So happy with where sales are at right now. And then, yeah, I mean, did you want a little bit of a background,
Yeah, it'd be helpful for people that may have not heard the last episode, just super quick, how you got into it and where you guys are at now with production.
Sure. So just super quickly, I got into this, kind of started as a side hustle in the kitchen of my one-bedroom apartment in Toronto in April of 2019, after having seen some videos, mostly like the Curtis Stone and Micro Acres YouTube videos. That was kind of what was around back then. I started with one rack, so capacity of 20 trays. We moved to Guelph. I was able to devote an entire room to it. So we were able to go from 20 to 120. That was still, I think that was kind of when the pandemic happened. I had given my notice at my full-time job, so it pushed me into kind of committing to this full-time. We pivoted in terms of our focus. We sell complete 100% to restaurants in the culinary industry. So we had to pivot to some grocery stores and a farmer's market and home delivery. But as soon as the pandemic ended, we went back to just culinary industry. In that time, so that was March 2020. By the fall of 2020, I had taken on my first commercial space. It was about a 450 square foot room, so still quite small, but we were able to increase our capacity to 300 trays. And then in, I want to say, the fall of 2023, we moved into our current facility where we the facility is just over 2,000 square feet. And we have, in the main system, we have a capacity of about 1,800 trays. But then with all the extra racks and stuff, we can do up to almost 2,000 trays.
Awesome. And then you said you had about 30% year over year growth. What is kind of, has your sales approach changed at all in the last year or two in approach? So how much of that was getting new customers and how much of that was creating more value for the current customers by selling more products to them?
I'd say it was almost strictly new customers. So it was just last year was a really good year for customer acquisition. I would say, I mean, we've also, I shouldn't undersell, that we've added new products as well. And we've kind of honed our things on the production side, but it was pretty much just new clients. And, what had previously been really successful for me was just using Instagram, mostly cold messaging through Instagram. But honestly, that method has really dried up lately. And I think it's because Meta probably changed how messaging works, or, who's able to see messages in what way. So I think, even if you follow someone now, if the first thing that you send to them is a private message, it goes into a subfolder, not into someone's primary folder. So it's just I'm noticing that a lot of my messages are going unseen. So having to shift a little bit. Actually, I really liked what you were talking about with Kyle from Ransom Farms. I actually got in touch with him after seeing your episode and started talking to him about how he's using LinkedIn and so I'm starting to change a little bit how I generate leads. And also we've never done any incentives. I had a hard time figuring out how to incentivize chef clients to make referrals. Normally you'd give someone a discount, right? You'd say, I'll give you a percentage off or a flat amount off. But how do you do that when the chef isn't the one paying the bill?
Yeah.
There isn't as much incentive because they're generally not the ones, with holding the purse strings. So that's not as much of an incentive. So I loved, Kyle had mentioned he does the like give 100, get 100 kind of thing. But I changed my thinking around that to like, maybe it's about offering my chef a $100 gift certificate for a restaurant, and then I can buy that gift certificate from one of my other clients. So there's like cross pollination happening.
Mhm.
Chefs are obviously foodies, so they're gonna, I think that they would appreciate going to check out other chefs and all that. So I thought that was a kind of smart way to incentivize referrals.
Yeah, no, I like that a lot. I think the way you're thinking of it is really smart, because you could just think of referrals as just give something and hope it kind of works, sort of thing. But just taking a step back and realizing that, like, you give a chef some sort of incentive that doesn't directly go to them, it doesn't really incentivize them the same way, because like it's going to the owner of the restaurant, which may be the chef, but I'm guessing generally speaking is not usually the chef. So yeah, I think that's a really smart way to, better align the incentives. And, with sales, like a lot of it is just aligning the incentives. So if you have a good product and your customer is happy with it, they're more likely already to want to give a referral. And then you're just adding in a clear incentive that directly benefits the person that's actually referring them, which I think is a really smart approach, especially with chefs. I love that. I think that's great. Have you tested that out yet? Because I know that episode came out pretty recently.
No, that was like, yeah, I just discovered it like last week. So no, I haven't implemented it yet. I've started using Sales Navigator. I signed up for Sales Navigator on LinkedIn. So I'm going to play around with that and see how that goes. I haven't implemented it yet, but I will, I'm definitely happy to follow up and let you know how it goes once we do start offering that. Referrals are really powerful when your clients are chefs. Like chefs know chefs, they talk to each other. It's a pretty close knit industry, and chefs move around a lot. So, whether it's just from having connections or whether it's chefs themselves moving to a new place and bringing you along with them, it just speaks to the importance of maintaining relationships and building good relationships.
Yeah, totally. In terms of like production capacity, do you guys have a lot of room still to grow and take on new customers at this point?
Yeah, so we are still, I would say, we're only we're less than 50% capacity for sure, but I that was kind of by design.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
wanted to I didn't want to keep iterating in small ways. This move to this location, the idea was that it would take, we have a fairly long lease, and I think it was a 5 or 6x of like our previous capacity. So I wanted to kind of give us some room to really grow into the space.
yeah. I think people don't always realize, like, when you get the point to expand, whether it's from your house to a commercial space or one commercial space to the other, by the time you're ready to expand, you're usually quite busy. So to try to run the business and plan an expansion, it's a challenging dynamic, especially when you have the fact that you have to somehow move the farm while also trying to keep production. Moving a farm is a big thing, and the bigger it is, the bigger it can be in level of difficulty. It's obviously doable. Like there's farms that do it all the time, but there's so many factors going in a new space. So I always recommend like trying to plan in advance. But in your situation, I think it's smart to, like, when you are smaller, you see the trajectory of sales and where the business is going. And yeah, there is a bigger risk by expanding into a larger space because you have a higher rent and fixed cost. But now you're in a position where you're much better off. So it's like a short-term potential extra expense at the long-term benefit of you and the business. So it's something to definitely consider because of, like I said, it is, a bit higher risk. It's depending on what the rent is as well. But it sounds like for you, it definitely paid off. And I think it's a really smart move in that you don't have to worry about, running out of space and then trying to find a lease. And that's like a 6-month process sometimes. And then moving everything and reorganizing and getting used to the new growing environment. It's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot there. I mean, my brain is going in a million directions. It takes so much planning and it takes support. Like if I was still just doing this by myself, there's no way that it would have happened because I had to lean on my staff at the old farm while I was at the new farm, built like physically building everything, assembling pallet racking and, doing all the plumbing and everything. Like it took months, and even giving myself a 6-month runway of overlap of the like old farm, everything was still operating out of the old farm. We just had like a drop dead date where the old lease was ending. So we had to be ready to plant and grow in the new space by, whatever it was, September, and I thought that 6 months was plenty, and we got everything there, we got it done, but I didn't have any time to grow test trays and see how kind of like start figuring out the little microclimates and where the airflow is and all that. So we just kind of had to hit the ground running, and it's been the past year and a half to, obviously had to tweak recipes here and there because things grew differently in the new space. But, you have to have staff, you have to be willing to take on debt or an investor or however you're going to finance the scale up. There's just so many factors to it. And running 2 farms basically at the same time is no easy feat. So, it takes a lot of planning, forethought, and just efficiency, and hopefully having a really good contractor, reliable contractor.
Yeah, totally. I think strategic planning is something that is, I don't want to say often, but sometimes overlooked as how important it is in this industry. And it's partially because of how labor intensive the business can be, especially if you're doing things manually in the early years and mostly doing it yourself. So, one piece of advice I always give people that are going through the expansion is like, if you're doing everything yourself, like have staff before you go through the expansion so that, they're trained. And then like, rather than getting to a new facility, having all that to do with plus training new staff, plus running the old farm, like it can turn into like a really chaotic and stressful situation. So strategic planning comes into play where it can really, really make your life a lot easier in actually, having success, and more importantly, like not getting to a point of burnout. Because that's a pretty because the business is year round. Like you can't just like like seasonal farmers, they just go away for the winter or take time off, or maybe they get a part-time job depending on what time of farm it is. But like they have a time away to strategically plan for the business where they're not in the day-to-day. With microgreens farms, you don't necessarily have that because it's generally speaking year round. So if you can like make that time, or like slowly allocate more time to that, it'll often lead to a much better plan for when you expand, or whatever it is with your business. Like if you want to take a pivot in some way to some other type of customer base, if let's say you're doing grocery stores and you want to pivot to restaurants, like take some strategy in doing that, and doing it in advance rather than like doing it on the fly is generally a pretty good idea.
Yeah, I'd love to speak just for a minute to that idea of like strategic planning, because I think, farms are at all different places in their trajectory, their growth trajectory and stuff like that. There's, farm, a small farm, you're still in your house, or you're at 100 or 200 tray capacity. I'd still say that's fairly small. I'd say we're more in that kind of middle category now. We're not like giant, microgreens company, but we're fairly well established at this point. And I think that there's something that I guess that the shortest way to put it is like knowing how to surround yourself with support, with other people, experts in various ways. And also, having an exit strategy is really important. How to add systems, systematize what you're already doing, but also adding systems that add value to your business. So like adding value to your business isn't always more clients, more equipment, whatever. Of course that adds value, but we have added value to the business by adding an HR, we didn't hire an HR person, but we hired an HR service that helps us draft contracts and review issues. Having that in place adds value to the business. We have, our SOPs, that adds value to the business. We have benefits for our full-time employees. That adds value to the business. Like anything that you can do, we have a CRM that we make, consistently manage and maintain. If and when you want to sell your business, all of that helps add value beyond just what your books are showing, because it's easier to just hand somebody the keys and they can just hit the ground running. So all that adds value to the business, but also surrounding yourself with people that will help you work through various issues, strategic planning being, one of the main ones. So like we actually have a strategic advisory committee that meets quarterly. And I brought in either people that I knew, like friends basically, or people that I knew that had experience in certain categories that where I'm not an expert. So one of my friends does marketing. He works for, he started a really great marketing firm. He's on our strategic advisory committee. One of my highest profile chefs is on my strategic advisory committee. And obviously that gets a little sticky with what we can discuss and what we can't discuss, but just understanding the mind of my clients is having him on board is super helpful for that. And then I have one official business mentor and maybe one or two kind of, friends that also do business mentorship that I talk to and run things by. So having people like that not only gives you a sounding board, but it also, at least for me, I really benefit from having some external accountability, like somebody else that's kind of keeping me on track. Because you kind of mentioned this, and this is something that my business mentor said to me, you can get, especially in a business like farming where the labor side is so high, you can get wrapped up in working in your business and not have time to work on your business. And so being able to delineate those two things, carve out time for both and not burn out, because this is where having staff and support helps, because if you have other people that can do some of the tasks, you don't have to burn yourself out doing all the labor tasks and then also trying to do the marketing and accounting and all the other stuff that needs to get done.
Totally. Yeah, no, I first of all, I love that you have a committee of people that you trust that have different perspectives. I think it's really, really important to have people like that, especially as you scale up, because all it takes is a few really key decisions that can either put you in a direction that's going to allow you to grow in a very efficient and profitable way, to the same decisions being potentially made for the opposite direction. So, I have, a business coach for the last, I think 2 years now. And it's by far the best investment I've made. I think about putting money in something in the market or something like that. And I think about investing in myself in that way. And it's you think about you learn a skill set and then you have that the rest of your life. So if let's say you're struggling with sales as a microgreens business, then it would, in my opinion, make sense to pay someone who's done it or has the expertise in selling in general, but particularly if you can, selling in the product that you're trying to sell, to get you through those loops and also let you have a perspective shift on how to do it in an effective way. And that is once you learn that skill set, you have it, right? And then you have it for the rest of your life. So it's a pretty powerful approach, but it's also great from an accountability perspective, because I know exactly what you mean, where it's you can get lost in the day-to-day and you have that external resource that kind of helps guide you and bring you back to, on a path that just to be thinking about the right things instead of getting lost in the forest. So yeah, it's been super helpful for me, and I'm glad to hear that you're on a similar path with having strategic advisors and having mentors in that way.
Yeah, I mean, there's also just the notion that as an entrepreneur, especially when it is at the beginning, when it is just you do have to wear all the hats. I took some courses in social media marketing through George Brown, and I had to learn accounting software, and I had to wear all these hats that I don't like wearing, it's not my cup of tea. So yeah, you can learn something and then have that skill set forever. You're right, which is great. And some people are, I don't know what the term is, polymaths, or like there are people that kind of want to know everything and have their hands in everything, which is awesome. And if that works for you, that's great. But then one of the first podcasts I ever did with Chris Thoreau, the subject was the kind of crux of the episode was about calling in the experts and knowing when you're at the limit of your expertise, and it's actually better, more valuable to use some of your resources, financial resources, whatever, to bring in somebody who that is what they do. They know it better than you, and you're going to get a bit of an education from them because you need to learn it. It's your business, but you can also kind of lean on them to take that stuff off your plate so that you can kind of stay focused. Like, I know what I do best in this business, and I can do everything, but I don't like doing everything, and I don't have to do everything because I've built it that way. But it is something that you have to kind of be in the right position and build it that way. But I think knowing when is the right time to call in the experts, to like hire a professional, is super important and can help propel your business.
Yeah. On that topic, I know we talked about this previously, was about having I know you hired a crop consultant. I'm curious on your experience with that, because like that's something I used to call, like in Ontario, we have something called OMAFRA, and there was a few rare instances where I just couldn't figure it out. And like microgreens is such a niche thing that at least back then there was no one I could just like call and pay to get the right answer for. So one of them was like this rare disease that came in on seed for brassicas, which was like, that was a really tough thing to figure out because it was like devastating like mustard crops. And then there was a few other about like disinfecting trays that MAFRA was really helpful with. So like your local ag extension can potentially help with like more basic things, but they're probably not going to know the specifics and like the detailed science of optimizing crops. So I'm curious on your experience with hiring that crop consultant, and what kind of experiments you did, and what the results were.
Yeah. So I mean, the reason I hired somebody as a contractor, basically, to an agronomist, essentially. And yeah, OMAFRA, the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture and Food and Rural Affairs, I believe something is the acronym. But yeah, I hired him. He was a doctorate student at the University of Guelph in the town where I am here. So it was great. He could actually come to the farm and see things firsthand. I had first been contacted by him actually years before. He was working for a company that was trying to develop specialized LED lighting, and he wanted to come in and do some measurements and stuff like that. So that's how we made the connection. And then when I was experiencing some issues with our crops, I thought, hey, maybe I'll reach out to a crop scientist and see if they can kind of lend some of their expertise, because I don't know all of the science. So, we were having issues with a few of our crops, specifically with basil, and then with some of our other like longer growing crops like lemon balm. Those are two just off the top of my head that I remember were really problematic. And when I say really problematic, like we were growing the basil was growing successfully, but it was just super yellow. And we were already using fertilizer at the time. And we were basically like, based on your suggestion of the Gaia Green, we had kind of implemented that, but it wasn't enough. It just still, we were finding it yellow. So he just suggested things that I would never have thought about. Like he's like, maybe we should change the photo period. Maybe they're getting overexposed. Maybe you need even more fertilizer. So we were just able to, and he was able to also bring like a scientific methodology to how we were testing things. Like if it was up to me, I'd be like, okay, well, let's just grow a tray this way and a tray that way. But like, no, he was like, okay, we need at least 3 trays of each different variation that we're testing so we can plot it on a graph and see the results and all this. So it was very scientific, and it was great because we were able to dial in our recipes as a result. We've made adjustments where now we do grow several varieties under a shorter photo period than our typical photo period. We also have 2 different soil recipes, essentially. So when we have a bale breaking machine, when we're busting up our soil, we will do 1 bale with 1 recipe for a fertilizer, and then 1 for a fertilizer recipe for our longer growing crops. So that was part of kind of like dialing things in. And I don't know that we would have come to that without that expertise of somebody making suggestions. And then, I mean, a huge factor for us as well is Guelph has notoriously incredibly hard water. So we realized that that was actually part of what was causing the problem. So, and I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't reached out to a fertilizer specialist who we now work with, who came in and offered to test our water for free. So we got that back. We found out what the issues are. And now we use some acidifying materials that help to lower the pH to get it down to a more workable level for our crops. So, it was just great to have somebody, a real expert, come in and kind of point to things that you may not, like, not that I don't know anything. I knew several tricks that I would use when I was having problems with the crop. You reduce your seeding rate, you change your watering. There's kind of obvious things that you can look to, but then there's things that aren't quite as obvious, but are great under testing when you can be rigorous and apply that methodology.
Yeah, just hearing that about the water alone, like most people immediately would think, okay, get an RO filter and just like filter everything out, which is an option. But if you just think about it, if you can like add something in that acidifies or take something out that, like, if lime was something that you added in, you can potentially take some of it out to get the level that you need, rather than spend the money and have recurring costs of like filters and having like having a water holding tank, because like to get RO water is, you're going to need a like take up space for that. So even just from that perspective, like, even if you hypothetically came to the conclusion on your own that you need to, change something with the water, normally you think, okay, the water is hard, let me change the water. But it sounds like a much smarter approach in your situation is change the acidity of the soil, which sounds, in my opinion, a lot easier, than having all the water filtered before it comes to the facility. I'm just curious on, like, your thoughts on that, and if you see the value in having a crop scientist, not just for that, but to give you solutions that are more cost effective.
Yeah, I mean, they're like, you're spot on. You definitely, sometimes it's good to just bring them in to evaluate the whole system or how things are working. But yeah, that was really tough to work through, actually, in terms of what we should do to treat the water or to treat the problem. The size of an RO filter we would need for the amount of water that we use and yes, we have much more space now than we did in our last commercial space, but it's still fairly tight, to put a tank down, to put whatever filters that you need to maintain. It's a lot. So that wasn't reasonable. Somebody suggested, well, what about like a dosatron, or basically like an injector that could inject acidifying agent into the water line? Well, then you need to worry about corrosion. You need to have that acid, and you have to handle that material. So now there's like extra health and safety concerns. There's more PPE, there's more training, there's more, like, what am I going to do? Build like a little shack outside so we can have a vat of acid. It just adds so much cost and complication. And then I went through and we tested every major soil producer whose soil you can get in Canada. We tried it. Like every peat-based, Lambert, Sungrow, Berger, like we went through every single one, and trying to find a producer that would do what's called a low lime mix. So basically, soil producers like Premier, who does ProMix, and what we use is ProMix, they add lime to their mix to increase the
pH.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they do make a low lime mix for people that grow plants that require more acidic soil. That was my easiest solution, is, hey, if we just start with a more acidic soil, as the water buffers it up, at least it's not going to buffer it to the point where we're seeing deficiencies in the plants. It'll buffer it up to a neutral. The problem is that, we're buying a good volume of soil. We buy 2 pallets at a time. That's like 60 bales of soil. But unless you can commit to an entire truckload, they're not going to do like a custom or special batch. We don't have the storage. We wouldn't go through it quickly enough.
Yeah.
We already noticed that sometimes when we get batches of soil that are like getting near the 6-month mark, that they start to get hydrophobic because the wetting agent is starting to break down. So there's all kinds of complications with that. We settled on we settled on ProMix HP, which is one of their readily available mixes. It's not a special blend or anything, but it is just luckily, naturally, a little bit more acidic. So it hasn't been as much of a problem. But that combination of the right soil, knowing the water, the right fertilizer, the right photo period, that kind of has solved pretty much all of our issues. We still have
Amazing.
issues here and there, and it's strange how like we'll fix one crop, another crop will have a problem. This is like the constant, balancing act of being a farmer. But I feel like that's actually kind of part of the fun as well.
Yeah.
Not that it's fun to have crop problems, but it's like, it's part of what makes it. It's something that's challenging that's also rewarding because it's like,
Yeah.
well, now we have a problem with our cilantro. It's growing and it's kind of slimy. So why is that happening? Is it airflow? Is it this? Is it that? And it's just a perennial thing. But yeah, working with experts and having them come in and solve those issues is great. I'd love to talk about fertilizer because I know you talk, you had that whole thing about super soil and using Gaia and everything. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about my experience with fertilizer because I think it is really important. So we've been using Gaia for a long time, years for sure. It is a good product. We use it on everything. We fertilize our shortest crop. We fertilize radish. It makes them come out bigger, faster. Like there's no reason not to use it. It's an organic product, but some concerns were raised by a former employee about some of the like health and safety concerns on the SDS for Gaia, specifically that it has silica. And in Ontario, silica is a controlled substance, so you need to have, they have to wear respirators when they're, and I mean, you should be wearing a respirator if you're mixing up soil, regardless. There's fine particles, but there were some health and safety concerns that came up that kind of prompted me to start looking into other options. So working with this fertilizer specialist, we're still kind of trialing things, but we have shifted a little bit where we're going to phase out the Gaia Green and we're going to start using this 20-10-20 granulated fertilizer. I believe it's a Peters is the brand. We're going to try a CFR, like a controlled, or CRF or whatever, like a controlled release, like a quick acting controlled release, because you can get really long acting controlled release fertilizers, but like a 40-day controlled release. So for that stuff that's longer, that's those grows that are 3 and 4 and 5 and longer, just to see. What we have been using is Gaia Green plus a product called Unimix. And Unimix is essentially what a lot of like soil producers will put in as their starting fertilizer charge. So we were using that as kind of like a boost, and it has worked okay. But my fertilizer person thinks that this CRF will be even better. So we're doing some experiments as we speak with that. But I think it's really important to not underestimate how fertilizer can contribute to your soil recipes, and that it's important to play with things,
Totally.
and to kind of switch things up sometimes if something's either not working or if you can find a better solution.
Yeah. First of all, I love this because like I love that the conversation like years ago was like fertilizer or no fertilizer, and now it's starting to shift to like what's the best fertilizer, because it's been one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast was there was some really not good information that's going to lead to lower levels of success for people's long-term like growing of microgreens. Like the vast majority of the industry still does not even use any fertilizer, which I'm sure you're aware of after use just from like no fertilizer to Gaia can be a massive difference, especially the longer the crop grows. And I'm glad that the conversation's starting where it's like, how do we optimize the fertilizer? Because from my testing, Gaia Green was the best organic fertilizer, but I was not
Yes.
able to, because my farm was certified organic, to do any sort of other experiments. But from what I did do some experiments in the early years, and what I found is with the synthetic fertilizers, the flavor can be affected sometimes. So like basil, the essential oils may not come out. So it's something to consider in doing the testing, whereas like, how does it actually taste? How does it smell? Because usually from my experience, and I hope someone can change us and prove it wrong, because that means the industry is growing forward. Like, I don't really care if Gaia Green's the best one. That's just what I found so far. But there's a different like mechanism that I don't understand fully the science, but plants like will absorb the nutrients a lot faster, generally speaking, with the chemical or synthetic fertilizers. That causes, like, especially things in basil and cilantro, for the flavor to be different. So it's just something to consider. But yeah, I'd love to like hear the results of it. I love the idea of mixing Gaia Green with a synthetic fertilizer, because then you're potentially getting the benefits of both. But if there is a synthetic fertilizer that works better, I have no doubt that the yields will be better with the synthetic fertilizer, because it's kind of like it's like taking like a supplement form of food versus a like whole food, which I'm not against, like, I take protein powder and I think there's benefits to that and combining it with whole foods as an example. But at the same time, it is easier for the plants to absorb because it's immediately available. So plants can usually yield more, but it's a matter of what's the quality of the product, what's the shelf life, and especially for things that essential oils produce the flavor, like basil, it may affect the flavor. So I'd love to, hear when you guys have an update on that. I think that would be so cool to be able to share with people, what the results of that are.
Yeah, I think that's a super important point. And, obviously, when you're selling to the restaurant industry, flavor is like one of the most crucial aspects of a product. I think, yes, harvest weight, but ideally more robust plants in general. But you're right, in the fact that we don't sell to grocery stores, we haven't had the impetus to need to stick with organic. You're probably right that Gaia is the easiest and best organic fertilizer for microgreens because you're able to mix it in with the soil. I know a lot of growers use stuff like ocean solution or a liquid fertilizer, and that's all well and good when you're still hand watering. Once you start using flood tables, it's, again, unless you have an injector, and even then, a lot of things can go wrong with that.
Yeah.
Doses can go out of whack or whatever. It's hard. It's a little bit harder to control, but mixing in with the soil, you know exactly how much you're putting in there, and you can control it a lot more. But yeah, not having the restriction of organic only fertilizer definitely is beneficial and opens you up to a lot of different products.
For sure.
I think I do just want to, along with, you mentioned that there's, especially when years ago in the microgreen industry, I think there was a lot of fertilizer is adultering what microgreens are supposed to be and yada yada. And I don't think people fully understood that, especially organic fertilizer is just naturally occurring elements that you're adding, and you're not bastardizing the product, you're not ruining it by adding something. I just want to you use the word synthetic fertilizer, but I just want people to know that just because it's synthesized and not organic doesn't mean that it's not also natural elements that have been synthesized. So it's not like you're putting chemicals into your food. It's just that it's not strictly using an unprocessed organic product like bone meal or whatever.
Totally.
So I just don't want people to get the wrong impression that just because we're calling it a synthetic fertilizer, that you're that it's anything that's still not ultimately a naturally occurring product.
Yeah, and look, I have nothing against traditional synthetic type fertilizers. I think if you think about you either don't fertilize the plant, you're gonna have less nutrients in the plant than if you fertilize them, no matter what the source of the fertilizer is. The plant is only able to grow if it has everything it needs, and then the more it has available, the faster it can grow, the higher yielding. So if you're not using fertilizer, and are choosing between, let's say you live somewhere in Europe or somewhere you can't get Gaia Green, but you can get synthetic fertilizer, I would 100% use synthetic fertilizer over not, unless the only exception is if you are trying to promote it or sell a certified organic product,
Yes.
because you legally can't do that. But you're going to make a more nutritious product by using fertilizer, which is where my methodology was I want to make the most nutritious, best tasting, cost-effective product, and fertilizer does all three of that. No matter what fertilizer, is going to bring you in a better position, because we have evolved to kind of taste usually fruits, as example, the more sugar they have, generally we've considered it to be higher nutritious, which is why they have this thing called the Brix index. With vegetables, it's a little harder, but we can taste when you eat a really good salad green. like it hits differently than when you eat something that's like, just part of it is vitamins. So vitamins degrade over time. So if something's shipped from far away, it may not taste as like quote unquote fresh. And that's often partially the breakdown of the plant mixed with like, vitamins starting to break down. But all the minerals stay in there. So even if it's older, it still has more nutrients in it. So it's just something that, I'm very, very passionate about, because I just think it just creates a better food system. Like I think one of the problems is like people only, they grow just for yield. Like no one's growing product on the commercial scale, except for market gardeners and small scale growers. But like on the big scale, it's all for yield. And, like if you have to eat twice the amount of food, you're getting twice the amount of calories for the same level of nutrients. It's like, is that really moving us forward as a society? And, it's great to not have people starve, but it would be a better solution would be, how do we optimize the what we add into the soil for the long-term health of the soil, and this is for outdoor farming, and then how do we for the nutrient levels to increase those, because that's why we eat food, is for calories and nutrients.
Yeah, and just to bring it back to microgreens and like the process of growing microgreens, I have always taken an approach where like I will pull back on my seeding density until I'm very exacting with how I want my micros to look. Again, because working with chefs, like they want stems cut a certain way. They want either just cotyledons, or they want it a certain size or whatever. Like I'll have a chef give me feedback to like, oh, could you make this a little bit bigger? Could you make this a little bit smaller? We'll adjust our recipe. But fertilizer is a very important factor because it will allow you, like you say, to kind of make up any losses in seeding density with the robustness of the crop, for example. So like, I don't want to dial back my seeding density to where growing it, like I'm not able to harvest enough off of a tray to make that tray profitable. I still need to be able to harvest a certain amount off a tray just mathematically to make it work. So fertilizer is that thing that kind of where you can reduce your seeding density, give the individual seedlings enough room to grow the way you want them, but they're still robust enough that they still have that weight and that like I guess like ultimately shelf life as a result of being robust.
Yes.
So yeah, it's a very important factor.
Yeah, and I think for people that are maybe more numbers focused, it could help to realize like if you have fertilizer in the soil and you do get higher yields because of that, that means you can plant less trays, you can use less seed, use less soil, spend less on labor for harvesting, and save on electricity for the lights, and be able to grow more trays in the same number of space. So it's like such a win in so many ways that, that's why it's like so obvious, to me with my experience of growing microgreens for so many years, that it has such a big benefit that I hope that more and more people see the benefit. And at the very least, just try it. Just like you can get Gaia Green on Amazon now, and you could just buy like a 2 kilogram tub and it's like 15-20 bucks or something. Like it might be the best decision you make if you don't currently use fertilizer, in terms of like improving quality, shelf life, yield, and then all the benefits on the financial side of doing less work for the same amount of time, or expenses, which I think is really helpful. On a completely other topic, regarding to sales, you mentioned before we recorded this that you kind of in the stage of having talks with a distributor, which is something I think newer for you, from my understanding. I'd love to delve into, because there might be people that are considering, like, it's a very attractive idea to work with distributors because it's like really scalable. You can like get the business larger in a pretty fast pace, generally speaking. It can be, not always. I'm curious on, your thought process of potentially taking on this distributor, and this may help other people in the process of like, as they scale their business, to decide if they potentially want to take on and work with distributors.
Yeah, it's a really tough decision space to take on a distributor. And I'll just explain a little bit why, just in case, your listeners aren't kind of familiar with our previous episodes or whatever. Like the way that we grow, and something that I think has been super successful for our business, for the business model of my farm, is we use what's called like an additive method of sales. So there's additive and subtractive. So some people, they have, let's say you have a capacity of 100 trays, you grow 100 trays and you sell as much as you can that week. And then whatever you can't sell, that's your loss, right? You either donate it, you eat it, you discount it, whatever it is. So that's basically like thinking of like kind of like an inventory model. Like this is how much I have, I'm hoping to move it. We use an additive method where we grow completely to order. So I've explained it before to some people, like it's almost like a CSA, like a community supported agriculture model, kind of, but for chefs. So they are and it's a bit of an education because most chefs are used to just reaching out to a distributor saying, I want this, this, and this, and then it shows up the next day. For us, they're buying into the idea that we are growing specifically for them. So it's almost like they're renting real estate on my racks, where the benefit to them is not only the direct relationship with me as the grower so that they can make those special requests, those custom kind of requests, but also the consistency. They know that they're never gonna contact me and I'm gonna say, I don't have that for you this week, because they have a standing order, we're growing it, they know they're gonna get it. So it requires a bit of an education and a bit of a buy-in on the part of the chefs. And it's just built into my product list when I send it out, my price list and education, where our policy is just, it's going to take, for example, we get a new client, they place an order. I let them know it's probably going to take 2 or 3 weeks for you to get your first order. But then after that, you're going to get it consistently week after week because we'll have it in the planting schedule. And then on the other end, if you need to make any changes or cancellations, we need at least 2 weeks notice so we can wind down our planting and we're not stuck on the hook with a bunch of stuff that we can't sell. Because again, I don't have inventory. I don't really have somewhere else to divert stuff like extras to. We use it for samples when I'm prospecting. We donate it to the food bank. That's fine. We always have extras. That's no big deal. But I don't want to be stuck with a ton of extra where we've spent all this, where we've already invested the time and the materials to grow it, but now we don't have anywhere to sell it. So we use the additive model, and that has really, and also a big part of the heart of the business, why I love this business, is talking to chefs. And I'm a bit of a foodie. I like nerding out with chefs and them talking about their cooking techniques and what dishes they're working on and all that stuff. So, the direct sale business and the being able to go into a kitchen and sell directly to a chef has worked really well for me because I'm passionate about that part of it. Selling to a distributor I have a lot of concerns and a lot of around what it means on a variety of levels. So I've been thinking about how do I protect my brand? So, as soon as, and this applies regardless of what method you're using for growing and selling microgreens, as soon as the product leaves your hand, your quality control goes out the window. So I can't control if I give somebody a clamshell and then they leave it open and it wilts and it's done the next day. I can't control if I give somebody a live tray and they forget to water it and it dies. If it's a chef, if it's a direct client and they tell me that something happened, I can educate them and say, well, this is what you do to make sure, and I often give my clients tips and tricks on how to store stuff. But with a distributor, there's now a middle person that's in between, right? So I have to rely on the distributor to protect my brand. Like I have to, and this is like, can we bake in whatever agreement we might sign, like a contract? Can I get them to commit to to sell things within a certain time frame? Like you must sell everything you're getting on this date within 36 hours, 48 hours, whatever it is, then there's, again, with the additive method, like distributors are not restaurant clients. They don't really have in the industry what's known as a par level, which is like a par level in a restaurant is kind of like, this is how much we know we use on a weekly basis. So restaurants have a par level. That's how we can do the additive method. That's how we can do standing orders. A distributor isn't going to have that. So now I'm going to have to decide whether I want to take on a bit more risk. Do I want to grow? And they obviously want a lot more. They would essentially become my biggest client overnight easily. Like they would essentially double our production, which is crazy. Like I wouldn't have to worry about all the extra
Yeah.
capacity we have on the farm. It would get chewed up with this one client, which is good for some reasons and bad for some reasons. Like we've been successful at growing a high quality, consistent product at the level we are now, but I have to hire more people. I have to have more equipment. I have to, so there's a financial investment. There's an HR investment. There's a reputational risk. There's just so many things flying around my head. And it also obviously, I think one of the biggest things is it just changes the trajectory of the business in such a significant way. It's no longer the same sales method. It's no longer going out, developing a relationship with the chef one on one, and being able to nurture those relationships. And that's obviously up till now been the success, been how I've been successful. So it's changing that. I'll no longer be prospecting. I'll just be working to satisfy these people. So there's pros and cons. Like I think I mentioned to you again in that kind of conversation we had a little bit before recording, that like on the positive side, what they're offering, like even if I'm losing some margin, they're a large enough distributor where they're able to reach like geographies that I'm not able to. So we're in Southern Ontario. I'm only delivering around Guelph and then around the GTA, but they can get stuff up to Muskoka. They can get stuff to Windsor and London and Ottawa. They can really cover such a huge territory. So that not only is beneficial for me in terms of volume, but brand awareness and all that, right? So that's a positive. And then I also mentioned, I love the idea where, I'm one person, I do all the deliveries. We have 2 delivery days to Toronto a week. But let's say a client has a super busy week and they run out of something. Well, if they can't wait till the next delivery day, then they could reach out to the distributor and get the same product.
Yeah.
So they know exactly what they're getting. So huge benefit there. So I'm really just trying to, and then there's like the idea of pricing and how to maintain pricing. If they're selling to the same clients, their sell rate has to be the same as mine. They can't be more or less expensive because it undermines my business, right? So there's that part of the negotiation. There's just so many things, but the reason why I'm even considering it, number one, they approached me. So that says to me that my bona fides, like that I've been kind of vetted by the industry to the point where a fairly large distributor, not only my clients are vouching for me, but that a distributor has enough confidence in my product where they're approaching me.
Yeah.
So that's a huge, like, I feel like a pat on my back just being approached by a distributor like that. So, so that aspect of it is great, but I think personally, I've always taken small steps in growing this business. I've joked before and said, I've always tried to focus on growing the business organically, but like not biting off more than I can chew, just growing as the demand has shown itself. Like, you talked about before when you're moving farms, I waited maybe a little bit too long. Like we couldn't take on more clients. We were literally at the ceiling. And I was like, well, we can't grow anymore. So, you don't want to be in that position. So, taking on a distributor is just a sea change in what this business is going to look like. And if we decide to go in that direction and you and I have this conversation a year from now, things could just be so significantly different.
Yeah.
So it's exciting. It's exciting to consider because of how it will propel the business forward much more quickly. But I'm trying to be very measured and cautious and make sure that my butt is covered every way I can think about it so that my product isn't compromised, our reputation isn't compromised, my balance sheet isn't compromised. There's just so many factors. Yeah, sorry, I'm a little bit all over the place, but that's some of the stuff that I've been kind of thinking about when it comes to working with a distributor.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of factors that most people probably may have not thought of. So I think it's really helpful to just get I don't want to say brain dump, but that's the word I'm thinking, like just where your head's at, because you're in the process right now of thinking about this, right? It's not like you've fully made a decision either way. But I think it's helpful because you're right. It does change the trajectory of the business. Like if you're at full capacity, overnight, as an example, like how does that change the future plans? The one good thing is you're in a good position that they reached out. Because that means that they're obviously quite interested. And then the second thing that's a benefit is you can choose. You have the choice. Like you don't have the nice thing about running your own business is like no one can tell you to do this or not do this. Like you get advice and you can kind of take everything in and then decide what makes the most sense for your business. So that's one thing that's really great that I love about running my own business is like the accountability and the responsibility is higher, but it's like you get to choose that. Whereas like if you are working at a job and someone makes a decision that you don't think is a great decision for the business, like there's not really much you can do other than voice your concern, because it's not your decision necessarily to make. So it's a really nice position to be in. And it's a big decision, but it's also a great opportunity, either way that like the business is moving to a point where, once customers start contacting you, that's like a pretty good, long-term to position, like your brand awareness, reputation, product quality. It's like, it's out there in the ether and it's just kind of spreading around and that just makes good things happen for the business. So first of all, congrats on the potential opportunity. I think that's really cool.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, it's exciting and scary, as I'm sure is an emotional combination that just about any entrepreneur can understand, especially microgreens growers. Yeah, I looking forward to letting you know how it goes. But yeah, I hope. I mean, either way, it's still a win. Even if we don't end up going with the distributor, I think it's validated what, how I've felt about the business and how, we built it to this place. Like there was a decision point, before I took the leap to this space. We could have stayed in the old space and kind of stopped prospecting and been perfectly profitable. And I would have had a fine, kind of like business for myself and my one employee. And, I would have had a decent lifestyle business. But I wanted a new challenge. I wanted more. I felt like the industry, like we had barely cracked the surface of the market out there. We're very lucky. I feel like focusing on the culinary industry as a microgreens grower really only works if you are selling to a market that is so large. Like having Toronto as a market, it's almost unlimited. There's like thousands of restaurants and other avenues like culinary in the culinary industry. So we're really fortunate. But yeah, having the kind of recognition at this point, like 6 years in, I feel like, it helps give me some confidence to move forward regardless of how it goes with the distributor.
Totally. I think there's, with the more people that are around, the more opportunity is available for anything because like generally speaking, you need people to buy things. So Toronto's a big city. A really interesting fact that I think will give some perspective is I know this particularly with Toronto, but I think honestly, most major cities, so many restaurants open that if you tried a new restaurant every day, or for every meal every day, you'd still never be able to try every restaurant. So that just gives you, obviously there's restaurants closing down, but just like it seems in society that population centers are just growing because there's more opportunity there. So that's where always the biggest opportunities generally are, unless it's like resource extraction or something. So being relatively close to the city, but getting the benefits of not necessarily being in the city with the high rents and high costing can be a good benefit, especially in a situation where you have a distributor that could potentially handle that. I know you delivered yourself to the restaurants in the GTA, but the fact that you can sell 2, 3, 4 hours away to other towns and cities, some of them that are quite big too, is a pretty great opportunity there. Before we wrap up, I'd love to hear given where you're at now, what do you see as the biggest challenge for you and the business going forward?
Oh boy. I mean, you and I have talked about this before. The first thing that comes to mind is HR. HR, the bigger you get, the more people you have, man, it is the hardest part of running a business. People are people and they take vacations or they get sick or they don't work out and you've invested time and it's just always such a difficult, it's the most difficult part of running a business. But I think that the biggest risk I mean, I'm always concerned about seed supply. That is definitely a risk, especially because we grow so many different varieties. Might be easy to get peas or sunflower or whatever, but it can be hard sometimes in a timely way to get, rarer varieties of seeds. So that's a bit of a concern always. And then, other than that, I think just the current political climate, like I don't really want to get into it, but just all the uncertainty. I've had several clients, Q1, again, I'll just circle back to what we talked about at the beginning, but like Q1 is always we see orders drop, we might have some attrition or whatever, but it was really exacerbated this year. We've had several clients, you know, pause or cancel their orders altogether because they're not sure about what their outlook is. So not only are they seeing less traffic, less reservations, whatever, they're already dealing with that, but then they are worried about their supply chain. They're also worried about, everybody's worried about disposable income. Are as many people going to be going to sit down at fancy restaurants or restaurants, period, right? So there's just a lot of uncertainty right now. And I think the biggest challenge for me and what I'm really starting to focus on is, and this is very recent, I've been talking about this with my mentors and such, but like microgreens are a frill. We're not meat and potatoes. We aren't a necessary thing for chefs to buy and have on their plates. So I think, working with high-end restaurants on the pro side, they're fairly evergreen. They have solid client bases. They're generally always busy. Like the big popular high-end restaurants, that's not so much of an issue. But some of the clients that I lost are big high-end restaurants. And, when you're a small supplier, it's not like cutting off a distributor. It's cutting off a small supplier where you're spending a couple $100 a week. You're very easy to just chop off from their perspective. And it's like, okay, now we've saved a couple $100 a week and it's not a big loss to them, especially if they can still get your product, maybe not your grown by you, but like they can get a similar product from their distributor. So, I'm trying to think about how do we make ourselves more irreplaceable? How do we make ourselves more essential? So that is a big challenge right now and one that I am actively working on. So maybe something to check in on next time, but it's really like microgreens when you're selling just the culinary industry, there's a built-in liability that the product is not essential. So how do you make yourself essential?
Totally. I think restaurant industries or the restaurant industry in general is definitely well known for being more affected as a whole during economic downturns or recessions. So that's where, like some farms may choose to have a combination of restaurant clients and grocery stores because generally speaking, it's a very good risk mitigation tool because when people less likely go to restaurants, they're still eating. So more likely they go to grocery stores. So grocery store traffic generally goes up. And yes, it is a more expensive item than, buying a regular salad mix, but it's still like there's more exposure, more traffic in grocery stores. So COVID was a bit unusual because like restaurants were literally closed, but then, grocery stores like boomed. So I wouldn't expect as big of a dip / increase in the grocery side, but it is one strategy that farms can use to have more stability. Or the other one is just know like recessions that's part of the economic cycle. And whenever there is recessions, like they pass and you have to just have enough capital to make sure you can handle lower sales during that period, which is pretty common as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, maybe it's a little too late to get into it. I've just always had issues with approaching grocery stores, and the barrier for me now, not that it doesn't work for some people, and it did work for us for a while. We just are in a position where we have a giant factory microgreens farm in our town that has recently received major investment from McCain Foods, millions of dollars, and there's absolutely no way that I can compete against them in the grocery space. So I've just let it go. It's just like it's not worthwhile when there's still just so much on the table when it comes to the culinary industry. And I'm also trying to shift this idea of moving more to LinkedIn to prospect. I'm hoping for more institutional clients, which also should be a bit of a shelter. Like if we're working with sports teams or hotels or whatever, like generally you're going to be a little bit more insulated. I think that's, again, my gripe against working with groceries isn't going to be ubiquitous for all growers, but it is an issue for me specifically because of this big grower that has undercut us.
So just keep in mind, I have like in the US, there's Aero Farms, which is the kind of equivalent. And a lot of growers, especially when they start out or early years, kind of think like, oh, like how am I going to compete with this like giant that sells like, $4 microgreens at Whole Foods? And it's a totally valid concern. But there is always opportunity because these big companies like Aero Farms, they're not selling at the local health food kind of level. Yes. They're selling to like the big players in the space because it's just more efficient. So there's room to sell to the smaller stores. And that's what I've seen is like, I personally have not seen a small health food or even like a premium grocery store that's not like one of the big chains actually have that product, or Aero Farms as an example. So that's just what I've seen. So it's good to kind of see like they're here and they're at a different price point, targeting a different market. And then most microgreens are going to be at a different scale that allows them to target a different level of customer and make it make sense. Because like if you're in the head of a company like Aero Farms, do you want to sell like $500 to a grocery store, or do you want to sell $3,000 or $5,000 to the big chain? It's just much more efficient, right? So there is opportunity, and there's not necessarily going to always be overlap, and that's where the opportunity is where there's not overlap. Because you're right, like it's going to be pretty hard to sell. And the other thing, just to mention, is these big farms, they don't grow basils, cilantros,
yes,
amaranths. So there's different opportunity there where like, even if you wanted to approach the big stores, like maybe they have a lot of issues with basil, which is really common. If they can get a local supply of basil year round, that's a pretty, interesting pitch to, just as an example, to, some of these bigger chains.
Yeah, there's so many ways to make it work. You're absolutely right. I will just say the local premium grocery store that I was working with for a long time that loved my product stopped using us for this farm that I'm talking about. So it can happen. And I'm not saying that that's the rule. That could be an exception in our case because they're also local, because their plant is here in town. But you're right. But I think that what you're saying also applies to any grower in terms of looking at, so I know a lot of growers, especially smaller growers, don't have order minimums. We have an order minimum because I don't want to run around for like $50 when I can have one client that'll do $400. That's 8 of those smaller ones that I don't have to run around to, especially when I'm the only delivery person, right? So, and this kind of could, segue back to the distributor, where there may be a world in which at some point I don't want to do my own distribution anymore, and where I do just kind of like decide that we'll let the distributor do all the last mile stuff, right? That we'll just drop everything off with them. They take it, the rest of the way. So we'll see. I mean, there's so many ways things can go, but yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think just hearing your perspective, because you're very similar to me in thinking strategically with these things. So rather than just being like, oh, I can get new sales, so I'm just going to take on the distributor, like the thought process and how you're doing that I think will be very helpful for people listening to this. So this has been a great episode. I really appreciate your time. And if listeners want to connect with you or learn more about your farm, where can they find you online and on social media?
Yeah, best place is just www.goldfarm, or on our Instagram, which is Goldfarm_Canada.
Thanks so much, Jacob.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Jonah.
Thanks for tuning in to the Microgreens Mastery Podcast. To access a wealth of insights, just click the subscribe button, stay notified about each new episode, and enjoy all of this wisdom for free. If you're ready to supercharge your microgreens business, visit microgreensconsulting.com for a gold mine of guides and resources. We've transformed thousands of microgreens businesses, and you're invited to join the success story. Let's stay connected. Follow us on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok at Microgreens Consulting for exclusive content and expert tips and wisdom. If you found this episode insightful, please leave us a review, spread the word, and let's share microgreens magic with the world. Until next time, let curiosity fuel your growth, and may happiness be your harvest. Happy growing, everyone.